I didn't become the person I wanted to be. I became the person I could tolerate. That distinction took me years to understand. When I was younger, I imagined life as something you build intentionally. You choose, you risk, you fail, you adjust. Somewhere along the way, that idea quietly shifted. Without noticing, I replaced intention with acceptability. I stopped asking, who do I want to be? I started asking, who can I live with being? At first, that felt reasonable, mature, practical. Later, it felt like a quiet surrender I never consciously agreed to. The change didn't happen overnight. It never does. It happened through 1,000 small negotiations with myself. Each one seemed harmless, sensible, responsible. I chose paths that didn't scare me too much. I stayed in situations that weren't fulfilling but weren't unbearable either. I told myself that passion fades, that meaning is overrated, that stability is the real prize. I wasn't miserable. That's what made it dangerous. My life hovered in a constant state of fine. Not good enough to inspire, not bad enough to escape. Just tolerable. I learned how to manage disappointment without naming it. How to live with the quiet ache of unfulfilled potential without calling it regret. I told myself that wanting more was naive, even selfish. After all, many people had less. That logic silenced me for years. From the outside, everything looked functional. I showed up. I delivered. I did what was expected of me. I learned how to be reliable without being present. People trusted me because I didn't surprise them. Inside, I felt increasingly distant from my own life. I noticed it in moments that should have felt alive. Achievements landed without weight. Compliments passed through me without impact. Even relief felt muted. It was as if I had turned the volume down on my own existence. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, long after everyone else had gone home. The office was quiet, lights dimmed automatically, the city outside wrapped in darkness. I should have felt accomplished. Instead, I felt empty in a very specific way. Not the emptiness of loss. The emptiness of accommodation. I realized I had spent years adjusting myself to fit a life that never quite fit me back. Every time something inside me resisted, I negotiated it away. It's not that bad. You can handle this. This is just how life works. Those sentences became my internal language. They helped me survive. They also taught me how to disappear slowly. I stopped expecting fulfillment. Stopped believing I deserved it. I replaced hope with endurance, curiosity with caution, desire with discipline. Discipline was praised. Endurance was admired. No one asked whether I felt alive. They assumed I did because I looked like someone who should. I began to see how much of my identity was built around coping. Not thriving. Not growing. Coping. I coped with boredom by staying busy. I coped with dissatisfaction by lowering expectations. I coped with regret by calling it realism. I didn't realize how much I had lost until one simple moment shattered the illusion. Someone asked me, casually, "Are you happy?" I opened my mouth to answer and froze. Not because the answer was complicated. Because I didn't know how to measure happiness anymore. I knew what was tolerable. I knew what was manageable. I knew what I could endure. But happiness, that concept felt abstract, almost irrelevant. I laughed it off. Changed the subject. Made a joke. But that question followed me home. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I had built a life optimized for tolerability. Not meaning. Not joy. Not even pain. Just tolerability. And the worst part was that I had convinced myself this was a success. I traced the path backward, looking for the moment where I could have chosen differently. There was no dramatic turning point. Just a series of small decisions where I chose comfort over honesty. I chose what made sense over what felt true. I chose what was approved over what was alive. I chose who I could become without rocking the ground beneath me. Each choice felt harmless. Together, they built a life where I existed without fully participating. That realization didn't break me. It unsettled me. Because it meant I hadn't failed. I had complied. And compliance, I was starting to see, is far more dangerous than failure. Failure forces you to respond. Compliance lets you fade quietly. I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence, and understood something with painful clarity. I wasn't living the life I wanted. I was living the life I could tolerate. And tolerance, unlike suffering, doesn't scream when it's killing you. It just stays. After that night, I started noticing how often I used the word fine. How are you? Fine. How's work? Fine. How's life? Fine. The word was perfectly designed to end conversations. It required no follow-up, no curiosity, no concern. It was neutral enough to be safe and vague enough to be true in the most minimal sense. My life was fine. And that realization terrified me. Because fine had become the ceiling. I began paying attention to my internal reactions during the day. Not the obvious ones, the subtle ones. The quiet resistance when the alarm rang. The heaviness before routine meetings. The way my shoulders tensed when I thought about the future. Not fear. Reluctance. It felt like my body was quietly voting against my life, one small sensation at a time. I realized how much effort it took to keep everything tolerable. How many micro-adjustments I made to stay emotionally neutral. How often I suppressed impulses not because they were harmful, but because they were inconvenient. Wanting more felt irresponsible. Wanting different felt ungrateful. So I learned how to want less. That skill was praised. You're so low maintenance. You don't ask for much. You're easy to work with. What they meant was, you don't disturb the system. And I had made peace with that until peace started to feel like suffocation. I noticed how I avoided decisions that required commitment. Commitment meant choosing a direction, and choosing a direction meant admitting that other paths would die. I had already buried too many versions of myself quietly. I wasn't ready to hold another funeral. So I stayed where I was. Tolerating. Enduring. Waiting for a moment of clarity that never arrived. Instead, something else arrived. Resentment. Not loud. Not explosive. A low, steady resentment that settled into my chest. Resentment toward the life I had agreed to. Toward the expectations I had absorbed without questioning. Toward myself for being so cooperative. I didn't express it. I internalized it. I became more controlled. More polite. More emotionally contained. If I couldn't change my life, I could at least manage my reactions to it. That strategy worked until it started leaking. I found myself snapping internally at small inconveniences. Feeling disproportionate irritation at minor disruptions. Those moments weren't about the situations themselves. They were about how little space I felt I had to be honest. I began to see how often I avoided stillness. How quickly I reached for distractions when silence appeared. Silence was dangerous now. In silence, I heard questions I had spent years negotiating away. Is this really all you're going to be? Is this the best version of your honesty? How long do you think you can keep tolerating this? I tried to argue back. I told myself I was lucky. That many people would gladly trade places with me. That dissatisfaction without crisis was indulgent. Those arguments had worked before. Now they felt hollow. Gratitude couldn't replace alignment. Perspective couldn't replace truth. I realized that tolerating my life required constant self-silencing. Constant editing. Constant adjustment. And the cost of that effort was slowly becoming unbearable. I noticed how often I fantasized about escape, not success, not reinvention, just escape. A different city. A different rhythm. A version of myself without history attached. The fantasy wasn't about happiness. It was about relief. Relief from being someone I no longer recognized. That scared me. Because wanting to escape doesn't mean you hate your life. It means you've stopped feeling at home in it. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. What am I actually protecting by staying? Who benefits from my toleration? What would happen if I stopped managing everything so carefully? The answers were uncomfortable. I was protecting my image as someone stable. I was protecting other people's expectations. I was protecting myself from the responsibility of choosing differently. Choosing differently meant risking regret. But staying meant guaranteeing it. That trade-off had shifted. One evening, sitting alone, I imagined myself 10 years in the future, still saying fine out of habit. Still managing dissatisfaction with discipline. Still proud of how much I could tolerate. The image made my chest tighten. Because I realized something brutal: tolerance doesn't build a life. It just prevents collapse. And collapse, I was starting to see, might not be the worst thing. I didn't need my life to fall apart. I needed it to speak back to me. And it wasn't. Not because it was broken. But because I had stopped listening to myself long ago. That realization didn't give me courage. It gave me clarity. I understood that continuing this way wasn't neutral anymore. It was a choice. A choice to keep becoming someone I could tolerate instead of someone I could respect. I wasn't ready yet to change everything. But I was no longer willing to pretend that toleration was enough. And once that line is crossed, the life you've built begins to feel fragile, not because it's weak, but because it's no longer honest. The change didn't come with relief. That surprised me. I had always imagined that the moment I finally acknowledged the truth, something inside me would lift. That clarity would feel like freedom. That honesty would feel like release. It didn't. It felt like grief. Grief for the years I had spent negotiating with myself instead of listening. Grief for the parts of me that learned to shrink so well that I mistook it for maturity. Grief for the version of myself who believed toleration was the same as peace. I didn't wake up and reinvent my life. I stopped numbing myself to it. And that was harder. Without the constant internal editing, emotions came back unevenly. Some days I felt anger sharp, unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Other days I felt sadness that had no clear cause. Sometimes I felt nothing at all, and even that felt more honest than before. Because I wasn't managing it anymore. I wasn't translating discomfort into discipline. I wasn't reframing dissatisfaction as gratitude. I wasn't correcting myself every time a thought felt inconvenient. I let the truth exist without trying to make it acceptable. And the truth was simple, and devastating: I had confused endurance with character. I had built an identity around how much I could tolerate boredom, compromise, emotional distance, quiet regret. People admired that resilience. I admired it too. Until I realized what it had cost me. Endurance kept me functioning. It did not keep me alive. For the first time, I allowed myself to sit with a question I had avoided for most of my adult life: what do I actually respect? Not what I can survive. Not what looks good from the outside. Not what avoids conflict. What do I respect? The answer wasn't dramatic. I respected honesty even when it complicated things. I respected courage even when it failed. I respected people who lived in alignment, even when their lives were messy. And suddenly, I understood why I felt so distant from myself. I had built a life I could tolerate. But I hadn't built one I could respect. That realization didn't demand immediate action. It demanded accountability. I started making changes so small they were almost invisible. I stopped saying fine when I wasn't. I stopped agreeing automatically. I allowed myself to disappoint people instead of disappearing quietly. Each small act felt dangerous. My body reacted as if I were doing something wrong. Years of conditioning told me that disruption was failure, that dissatisfaction was weakness, that wanting more meant being ungrateful. But something else was happening beneath that fear. I was beginning to feel solid. Not confident. Not certain. Solid. As if I were finally standing on my own ground instead of adjusting myself to fit someone else's expectations. Some people noticed the shift. Some didn't like it. Some assumed it was a phase. Some drifted away when they realized I was no longer as easy to read, as easy to rely on, as easy to place. That hurt. But it also clarified something important. Much of my value in my old life came from how little space I took up. When I started taking up space emotionally, honestly, the structure around me changed. Not everything survived. And that's okay. I stopped trying to preserve everything. Preservation had been my instinct for years. Preserve comfort. Preserve stability. Preserve the image of someone who had it together. Now, I was more interested in presence than preservation. Presence required me to feel things without immediately resolving them. To make choices without complete certainty. To accept that some regret is unavoidable and that avoiding all regret is what had cost me the most. I began to see regret differently. Not as proof of failure but as evidence of engagement. Regret means you cared enough to choose. Tolerance means you stayed still long enough to disappear. I don't romanticize this ending. Some days are still heavy. Some choices still scare me. I don't wake up every morning feeling inspired or fulfilled or sure. But I wake up feeling here. And that is new. I no longer measure my life by how manageable it is. I no longer ask how much I can endure. I ask whether I am being honest with myself in this moment. That question doesn't always lead to comfort. But it leads to integrity. If you're listening to this and your life feels fine in a way that leaves you strangely empty, I want you to hear this clearly: a tolerable life can still cost you everything that makes you you. Comfort can be a cage if it requires silence. And endurance is not a virtue when it replaces truth. You don't need to destroy your life to change it. You don't need a breakdown to justify listening to yourself. And you don't need permission to want something that feels alive. I didn't become the person I always dreamed of being. But I stopped becoming someone I could merely tolerate. Now, I am becoming someone I can face in the mirror without negotiating away my honesty. That doesn't make my life perfect. It makes it real. And after years of living in a state of quiet accommodation, real even when it's uncomfortable is more than enough.